The cold came first. Not a biting winter chill, not frost on the window or a breeze sharp enough to cut through wool. This was something else. A darkness that stretched from horizon to horizon, thick and gray, had swallowed the sun. It had been there since late spring, and though no man alive could explain it, everyone felt its hunger. Even at midday, the light was dim as dusk, and the air seemed to move more slowly, as if the world itself had been wrapped in heavy cloth. In a small village nestled between the worn hills of the eastern Roman provinces, what had once been called the Empire, but now merely the edge of something forgotten, there lived a man named Cashin. He had once been a notary in the provincial capital, skilled in letters, known for his calm hands and quiet patience. But that was before the taxes stopped being collected, before the city's roads fell into ruin, and before the governor's villa burned down in an uprising no one truly understood. Now Cashin lived in a mud-brick hut with a leaking roof and listened to the groaning of the earth. His neighbors had once been farmers and traders, but as the light failed and crops withered under the breath of this gray death, they became scavengers, then beggars, and then something else. Thinner, sharper, half-men hollowed out by hunger. They did not ask for stories anymore. They asked for grain, for salt, for something to keep their children from wasting away. But there was nothing left to give. The last of the stored barley had turned sour. Even the goat's milk tasted of ash. Cashin wandered further each day, not from hope, but because staying still brought a kind of madness. He walked across dry fields where once wheat had grown tall and golden. He saw the remains of festivals painted on the walls of broken shrines, colors faded by time and smoke. He walked past corpses. Not all were buried. In the worst of times, burial became a luxury. The bodies lay under blankets of straw or stones, or sometimes just under the open sky, left where they fell. No one looked at them long. In the West, where the old stories said Rome had once been eternal, word spread that famine had taken cities whole. Markets were empty, and travelers told of mothers selling their children for bread, of priests preaching that the end had come and that this grayness was God's hand. In Gaul, in Italia, and beyond the Alps, it was the same. The sun was gone. It had been months. No one could remember when they last saw it clearly. Cashin's feet took him to the sea, though he had never been a sailor. He reached the ruins of a once grand port, where seaweed now grew on marble columns and gulls screeched like lost souls. There he found a monk sitting alone by a toppled statue of Poseidon, now faceless and covered in moss. The monk's name was Flavius. He had been copying texts by hand before the abbey burned in a fire that came without lightning or cause. Flavius had saved a single scroll, something in Greek that he could barely read, but he swore it carried a prophecy. Cashin and Flavius stayed together for a time. They spoke little. There was nothing to say that could ease the cold in their bones or the ache in their bellies. They found dried fish once, caught in a net left behind by someone who had not returned. They chewed the leathery meat in silence, grateful. Days blurred. The sea looked like lead, the sky like charcoal. Somewhere inland, a mountain had died, vomiting fire and dust into the heavens. They didn't know it by name, Krakatoa perhaps, or something older, but its breath had choked the skies of half the world. They followed a caravan south, a line of desperate figures dragging carts and children, hoping to reach the cities of the Nile. Word was that Egypt still had grain, that the river still flowed. But as they moved, Cashin saw the same signs: abandoned farms, burned villages, and the worst of it, the silence. Silence was the sound of death spread too thin to scream. Outside Antioch, they passed a camp where sickness had settled. Men coughed black blood, and women buried their faces in cloth soaked with vinegar. The smell was thick, rot, sweat, fear. Cashin turned back from that camp and walked the long way around. Flavius followed, his thin frame swaying with exhaustion. In a grove of olive trees long since turned gray with ash, they met a child. She wore a necklace of shells and spoke in a language Cashin didn't recognize. Her feet were bare, her hands calloused. She led them to a cave, where her grandmother lay dying but still offered them a stone bowl of stew made from roots Cashin dared not name. They ate it anyway. Hunger breaks every law. As the child slept, Flavius read aloud from his scroll. The words were strange, ancient. He said they came from a time when the gods still walked the earth, when the sun was a chariot and the stars were lamps of flame. Cashin listened not because he believed, but because it was better than silence. Winter came early, though no one could tell the season anymore. Snow fell in places where it had never fallen before. Rivers froze. The winds cut like knives. Cashin wrapped himself in rags and tried not to dream. When he did sleep, he dreamed of fire in the sky, of a sun bleeding smoke, of fields turning to dust with a single breath. In Constantinople, the emperor had ordered prayers, sacrifices, ceremonies. But none could pierce the shroud that covered the heavens. Flavius died on the road just before the city gates, muttering verses about fire and darkness. Cashin buried him under frozen soil, using a broken amphora to dig. The child, whose name he never learned, placed one shell from her necklace atop the grave. Inside the city, things were worse. Riots had left the streets stained. The poor fought over scraps. The rich had fled to their country homes, only to find that the countryside had nothing to offer. The plague had arrived in whispers, then in screams. It was not just hunger anymore. It was fever and pustules and death that crept into every crack of the empire. Cashin found a place in an old bathhouse, now empty and cold. The tiles still held the memory of heat, but no one came to bathe. He watched the smoke of the city rise into the sky and vanish into the gray. Some said this was punishment for sins, for vanity, for forgotten gods. Others said it was the end of the world, not with fire but with shadow. He began to write again. Not official records. Those days were long gone. But scraps of memory, names of people he'd seen, dreams he couldn't shake. He wrote them on the walls, on the edges of broken tablets, on the backs of wax-covered boards. He wrote so that something would remain, something human. One day, as he walked through the forum where statues had been pulled down and burned for warmth, he saw a tree. It had not bloomed, but its branches held a single cluster of green leaves. He stared at it for a long time. A woman carrying a child passed him without speaking. The baby's eyes were closed, its breath faint. Cashin did not follow them. He stood beside the tree and whispered a prayer to no god in particular. The sky remained gray, the sun a ghost, and the year went on. The days passed without markers. No solstice celebration came, no festival to honor the planting of fields that could no longer yield. Time became something Cashin measured by footsteps and silence, by the hunger that gnawed a little deeper each morning and the bones of birds that cracked more easily when roasted over fire. The tree in the forum became his anchor. He returned to it each day, sometimes sitting beneath it, sometimes pressing his hand to its bark as though he could share warmth with it. A mad thought, he knew, but the world was mad now, and it did not punish those who whispered to trees. A group of pilgrims arrived in the city. They came barefoot, wrapped in ragged cloaks of horsehair and linen, led by a boy who claimed he had seen a vision of the sky splitting and a staircase descending. He said angels had walked among the sick in a village near the Euphrates, healing them with ashes and song. No one believed him, but they listened because a lie with beauty still offered more comfort than truth without mercy. Cashin watched them from the edge of a ruined fountain. One of the pilgrims approached him. A woman with deep lines in her face, eyes set like stones, and hands that trembled as she offered him a piece of dry bread. He thanked her and kept it in his pouch, too afraid to eat it all at once. That night he walked through the southern quarter, where the pestilence had been strongest. The buildings leaned like drunks, and the doors had been sealed with wax and paint, marked with signs that only those trained in scripture could read. He had studied such things once in another life. Now the symbols looked like the last gasps of a dying tongue. He found a boy alone, no more than 7, curled up beside the broken leg of a statue of Theodosius. The child said nothing when Cashin approached, just looked up with eyes that had seen too much. Cashin gave him the bread. The boy chewed it slowly, not out of fear but ritual, as though tasting each moment of kindness like it might be the last. Somewhere nearby, dogs howled. Or what passed for dogs now? They had become thinner, feral, eyes like beads, teeth always bared. Cashin threw stones until they retreated. The boy fell asleep and Cashin stayed by his side until dawn, or what passed for dawn, when the light turned from black to ash. They lived together after that, if such a word still had meaning. Cashin did not ask his name. Naming things seemed foolish now, like writing stories in sand as the tide came in. He called him the boy, and the boy never corrected him. They moved through the city slowly, scavenging. A baker's basement yielded a sack of oats. An abandoned school had candles. A soldier's house, identified only by the rusted sword hanging over the hearth, held a jar of salt and a tunic still warm from mice nesting in its folds. They took what they could carry. They did not speak often. Silence made them lighter. Once a group of riders passed through the city gates. Not soldiers, there were few left, but mercenaries perhaps, or looters, men with fur cloaks and blades curved like smiles. Cashin and the boy hid in the vaults of an old granary. They stayed there for 3 days, eating oats mixed with melted snow, watching the shadows pass beneath the cracks in the stones. When they emerged, the forum tree had been hacked down. Its trunk lay in pieces, blackened and half-burnt, as though someone had tried to cook with it and failed. Cashin stared at the stump. The boy placed a stone on it and walked away. Word came, whispered from traveler to traveler, that in the far east strange lights had been seen in the sky, and snow had fallen in lands where the summer never ended. In China it was said the emperor had ordered thousands of prayers. In the south, in the lands beyond the desert, a king had built a tower to reach the sun and demand its return. Nothing had worked. No king, no priest, no prophet could reverse what had been done. Some said it was the end of days. Others said it was only the beginning of something worse. The boy became sick. A slow illness, not the fast plague that had taken thousands, but a weariness that grew in his limbs, a heaviness behind the eyes. Cashin tried herbs. He tried fire and salt and prayer. He traded his last set of boots for honey and boiled it into wine. The boy drank, smiled weakly, and fell asleep. He did not wake the next day, or the day after. Cashin buried him in the schoolyard, beneath the old fig tree that had never borne fruit. He sang a hymn he half remembered from childhood, voice cracking, hands shaking. No one watched. No one came. When it was done, he sat beside the mound and tried to recall the sound of laughter, but it escaped him. The weeks that followed became thinner. Cashin no longer counted days. He wandered the city like a ghost, wrapping himself in cloaks too large, eating snow and moss, speaking aloud to no one. Once he thought he saw Flavius again, standing by the broken aqueduct, holding the scroll. But it was only a shadow. And then, perhaps it was spring, perhaps not, something shifted. It was a morning like the ones before, gray and cold. But when Cashin stepped outside the bathhouse, he saw a thin line on the horizon. A line of light, pale gold, weak, but there. He blinked. He stared. He waited. The sun did not return fully. It was still dim, still wrapped in haze, but it was there, and he was still breathing, still walking. In the ruined forum where the tree had once stood, he placed a stone and beside it another, and then he kept walking. He walked without direction, only the instinct to keep moving, as if stillness might invite the darkness to root itself deeper within him. The city, half crushed and half abandoned, no longer echoed with cries or songs or sermons. Those who had remained grew quiet, almost reverent in their despair. People no longer looked at one another. They glanced, nodded, and passed. Their faces were not angry or even sad anymore. They were weathered like stones smoothed by years of rain. Cashin passed them silently, watching, listening to the shallow rhythm of breath in a world that had almost forgotten how to draw it. The sliver of sun did not return the next day. It had been a moment, a single blink of brightness, and then the gray returned. But that moment had changed something in him. He began to collect things again. Scraps of parchment, bits of wood that might burn, broken hinges from doors that no longer needed them. He took these to a ruined temple on the outskirts of the city, a building once dedicated to Apollo, though now little more than a cracked dome with a fallen frieze of horses and chariots. Inside it was dry and wide and open to the sky. He made it his shelter. There, in the center of the room, he arranged what little remained of the old world. Coins no longer traded, carvings from collapsed homes, fragments of scripture and poetry, children's dolls with one arm missing, a piece of a lyre with broken strings. He laid them out carefully, one by one, as if restoring an altar no god would ever use again. But it was not for gods. It was for memory. It was for the boy. It was for Flavius. It was for himself. He began to write again, more than just names or dates. Stories, memories, in the margins of old scrolls, across the backs of abandoned ledgers. He wrote of what the city had been and what it had become. He described the fog that had eaten the sun, the color of the sky that never changed, the way hunger had shaped the bones of men into strangers. He wrote of a goat he once owned named Vika, who had eaten his only pair of leather gloves in a fit of spite. He wrote of his sister, long dead, who used to braid his hair in the spring and taught him the names of stars. He wrote because silence was no longer enough. A girl came to the temple one day, her face half covered by a scarf. She asked him for shelter. He nodded and cleared space by the wall. She brought a basket with her. Inside were dried figs, hard as stone but edible when boiled. Her name was Dion. She said she had walked from the hills, where her village had been swallowed by a rock slide. She didn't cry when she told him this. She only asked if he had paper and ink. He gave her what he had. She too began to write. Others came. Not many, but some. A crippled potter who could no longer shape clay but who remembered every pattern his father had taught him. An old widow who sang lullabies in a language Cassian had never heard. A former soldier missing 3 fingers, who taught the children who wandered in how to whittle toy animals from firewood. They didn't call themselves anything. Not a school, not a temple, not a commune. They were just people who had refused to die. The world outside the city remained broken. Travelers spoke of bandits, of wildfires in the forests of the north, of entire villages abandoned without a trace. But they also spoke of something else. In the east, a monastery had grown fat with crops. The monks had discovered a new method of planting under ash-heavy soil. In the south, a river that had vanished now flowed again. Small things, quiet things. Cassian didn't believe in miracles, but he believed in small things. Sometimes the sky would clear for an hour. Light would pour down, color returning to the stones, birds calling in surprise. Then it would fade. But each time it returned, it stayed a little longer. Cassian began carving again, using charcoal and dull blades. Not on stone, there was too little strength in him for that, but on wood and clay. He etched the names of the dead, the shape of the boy's face, the lines of the sun as he remembered it before the year turned to shadow. He made no idols. He carved memory. Dion once asked him why he stayed, why he didn't go south to Alexandria or east toward the cities untouched by plague. He looked at her and smiled, though his face rarely remembered how to do so. He said, "Because here is where the darkness came, and here is where it must be answered." When he slept, which was rarely and never deeply, he dreamed less often of fire and smoke. That he saw fields. Still blackened, yes, but broken open now with green tips pushing through the ruin. He dreamed of children playing in the temples, of stories spoken aloud around a fire, of music. Always distant, like a memory of a song once heard in a tavern, but still real enough to wake him with a start. Sometimes he walked the streets again. The city, for all its wounds, had not died. Roofs were repaired. Bread was baked, though rarely shared. A market had begun again, not far from the aqueduct, with women trading candles and men selling boiled roots from carts with broken wheels. He passed through it quietly. They nodded to him. They knew him as the scribe who spoke to no gods, who wrote without reason, who once buried a boy beneath a fruitless tree. Years might have passed, though no one counted them the old way anymore. The dark days grew fewer, and the light, thin, fractured, and tired though it was, returned more frequently. Trees began to bud. The wind carried something other than dust. Hope was not spoken aloud, but it lingered in the corners, in the way people looked at one another a second longer, in the way the songs from the widow's lips gained rhythm once more. Cashin remained in the temple. His hair turned white. His eyes faded. His hands trembled, but still they wrote. His records were strange, fragments, laments, visions, and everyday nonsense alike. But each word was a brick, a stone, a thread sewn into a tapestry that might be found by someone centuries later and understood. Not as prophecy, not as scripture, but as truth. And though he never said it aloud, not even to Dion, he sometimes believed that history had a pulse, slow, faint, and nearly smothered beneath the ashes, but still beating. And so long as someone remembered how it once sounded, it could never fully die. One late evening, when the wind had quieted and the sky hung above like a bruised veil, he sat alone on the temple steps with a scrap of parchment curled in his hand. It had once been the margin of a tax record, long outdated, but the texture was clean and it held ink well. Cashin dipped his stylus and wrote slowly, carefully, the way one might speak to a child or a dying man. He described the way the wind sounded when it passed through broken marble columns. He described the way moss had claimed the base of a statue no one remembered the name of. He described the color of Dion's laughter, how it rang against the stone walls like bells that had never been cast. He did not know why he wrote these things, only that if he didn't, they might never exist again. The temple was not full, but it felt alive now. There were mats spread across the floor, herbs hanging from the rafters, shelves of dried leaves and bark, scrolls bundled in cloth, carvings of plants and stars and names that no longer had owners. Children came during the day, some orphaned, some simply curious, and they sat cross-legged on the floor while Dion told them stories. Not always real ones. Sometimes she invented tales about birds who spoke in riddles, or mountains that wept tears of gold, or a sea that carried dreams if you listened to its waves long enough. Cashin listened from the back of the hall, his hand resting on a pile of dried inkstones. He never interrupted her. One of the children once asked, "What happened to the sun?" And Dion paused, looked to Cashin, then smiled. "The world forgot how to sing," she said. "So the sun left to go listen for it somewhere else." The child had frowned, unconvinced, but said nothing more. The temple's roof leaked in one corner, and one spring night, water poured in like a weeping god. Cashin and the others worked by lamplight to seal the breach with old tar, cloth, and stubborn hope. When morning came, soaked and shivering, they laughed. It was quiet, almost ashamed laughter, but it was real. A young man came from the east, carrying news on papyrus that had survived the damp. He wore heavy boots and smelled of river mud. He told them of a place in Antioch where people were building new walls from the ruins of the old ones. They used broken columns and melted bronze. They sang while they worked. He told of a scholar who had found a way to grow barley by mixing ash and clay and planting under moonlight. He told of markets reopening in coastal towns. And he told of travelers who had begun to keep records again, not of kings or battles, but of daily life, of birth and death and strange weather and stranger dreams. Cashin listened, nodding. He offered the man a place by the hearth, and that night they exchanged stories. Not for coin, not for favor, but for the joy of remembering something worth the telling. As weeks blurred into seasons again, the sky began to shift. It never returned to the bright blue of childhood memories, but it no longer hung so heavy. Light seeped in like a timid visitor. Trees leafed out, hesitant but willing. Birds returned, fewer but braver. And the silence that had once choked every street began to break, little by little, under the weight of voices. Cashin grew slower. His joints ached when the wind blew from the north. His hands, once steady, now quivered so that Dion often wrote for him. but still he tried. He sat by the columns with the sun, when it came, on his face, and he spoke stories aloud while she etched them in charcoal or ink. His voice, once crisp with scholar's precision, had softened with age and loss, but it carried the weight of memory. He spoke of the great year of shadow, how it had not ended all at once, but loosened its grip like ice melting from stone. He spoke of the tree in the forum and the boy who had never been named. He spoke of Flavius, and the lesson he had once read aloud under the weight of a dying sky. He spoke of how remembering had kept the light alive, even when it could not be seen. One morning, before the others had risen, Cashin stood alone in the temple's garden, once barren, now wild with herbs and weeds and the bright yellow flowers that needed almost no sun. He touched the soil with a hand gnarled like a tree root. It was soft, damp. It smelled like life. For the first time in years he wept. Not from pain, not from grief, but from the weight of being alive when so many were not, and from the stubborn beauty of things that refused to stop growing. Later that day, Dion found him asleep in the sunlight that spilled through the roof. His hand still rested on a half-written scroll. She did not wake him. Instead, she sat beside him and began to read what he had written. The children came in one by one and sat with her. She read aloud, softly, gently, the words of a man who had lived through the end of the world and had chosen, against every reason, to keep remembering. And the light remained. Days passed, then weeks. The scroll Cashin had left half-written became the first of many that Dion would preserve. She bound them in leather when she could find it, stitched together with old thread from a merchant's abandoned home. Each scroll bore the same symbol on its edge. Not a religious mark, not a royal crest, but the simple shape of a sun, half obscured by a line of charcoal across its crown, like the eclipse that had marked the age they had survived. Dion wrote in the margins. Not corrections, she never dared change his words, but reflections. Her thoughts, her memories, what she saw through the cracked lens of the life that continued. She taught others to write. She made ink from boiled bark and soot, from the faded remains of dye left in forgotten chests. She turned the temple into something between a library and a home, where pages dried on strings like laundry and stories echoed against stone walls. The children grew. One of them, a boy named Orion, had been too young to remember the year 536, but he listened with a seriousness beyond his years. He asked questions no one had answers to: why the sun had gone dark, why the crops failed, whether the gods had turned away or if they had simply fallen asleep. He loved the garden most. He planted beans, garlic, and bitter greens and spoke to them as if they were old friends. When the first bloom of saffron appeared along the edge of the stone path, he picked it gently and brought it inside, placing it on Cashin's old writing desk without a word. Sometimes travelers brought stories of strange events. Birds flying in perfect circles for hours. A fish washed up bearing marks like letters on its scales. A woman who dreamed of a sun that sang. Most passed these tales off as madness, but Dion listened to all of them, committing each one to parchment. She believed, as Cashin had, that the stories mattered more than whether they were true. One harsh winter, wind blew down part of the eastern wall. They rebuilt it with stones scavenged from the city's edge, where marble had been softened by time. Orion led the work, now taller than Dion, his hands rough from farming. He did not speak much anymore, but when he did, it was with purpose. He found a cracked mosaic under the rubble. It showed a river lined with trees, a silver fish leaping toward the sky. He and Dion cleaned it carefully, then laid it at the entrance to the temple, so that anyone who walked in would step across the image of life rising. People came more often now. They brought stories, offerings, children. One woman, a weaver from the highlands, brought wool dyed with lichen and ash. She wove tapestries based on the old stories Dion read aloud. One was of the year of ash, as they called it now. It showed a great black sun, a man carrying a child through fire, and a broken tree with roots that stretched towards stars. Another tapestry depicted the Temple of Memory, with scrolls like wings and fireflies flitting through the rafters. The temple, without trying, had become something sacred. No one named it officially. No priests claimed it. It belonged to the past and the present both. On some evenings, Dion would light 3 lamps. One for the dead, one for the living, and one for what they hadn't yet understood. And the children would sit around her, the older ones leaning on the younger, quiet and listening. Sometimes she read from Cashin's old scrolls, other times from the newer ones, and sometimes she simply spoke from memory, weaving the story of the world from the fragments that remained. Years passed. Some who had once lived in the temple left to build homes elsewhere, carrying with them copies of the scrolls and seeds from the garden. They took stories and planted them like roots in other towns, villages, ports. A merchant spoke of hearing a tale in a market far south, about a man who whispered to trees and saved a child from fire. The names had changed. Cashin was now Caesarion the Lightless, and the city was no longer remembered by its Roman name, but the soul of the story endured. And in that way it survived. Dion's hair turned white. Her fingers grew stiff, but she never stopped writing. Orion cared for her, bringing her broth and walking with her through the garden. On warm days she sat under the olive tree, now old and leaning, and listened to the wind. Sometimes she thought she heard Cashin's voice in it. Not words, just tone, like the sound of someone remembering aloud. When she grew tired, she told Orion to keep writing. "Not because it's important," she said one night, "but because it reminds you what was. And that matters more than anyone realizes." He promised. And when at last she did not wake one morning, he lit 3 lamps in her name. He buried her beside the fig tree, where the boy Cashin once loved had also been laid to rest. He placed a scroll beneath her hands, wrapped in cloth, and another on the stone beside her, blank, waiting. And the writing continued. The temple still stood. The garden still grew. The scrolls multiplied. The wind still moved through broken marble, and the stories, fragile, human, stubborn, drifted like dust into the future. Years slid over the world like a thin layer of ash, quiet, subtle, and often unnoticed until it settled into every corner. The boy who had once knelt beside flowers and listened to stories was now a man whose hands were darkened by ink and soil both. Orion no longer counted seasons, not by harvest or equinox, but by stories told, by children born, and by the slow return of color to a world that had once drowned in gray. The temple had changed shape. Not physically. It still bore its cracks and its slanted roof and the quiet, collapsed wing where time had triumphed. But something in its soul had shifted. It was no longer a refuge from the world's collapse. It had become something more. A place where the past was planted like seed and the future might one day grow around it. Travelers came from lands with names no longer found on maps. They brought strange words, rare seeds, and scrolls written in scripts that twisted like vines. Some stayed for a night, drawn by the warmth and the whispered promise that stories were still spoken here. Others stayed forever, weaving themselves into the fabric of the place as silently and completely as thread into a cloak. Orion kept writing. His script was not as elegant as Cashin's, but it carried weight. He recorded things others overlooked. The sound of rain after a long drought, the color of the sky before a storm, the taste of boiled bark when rations ran low. He wrote of grief when a child fell ill, and of wonder when a goat gave birth to twins under the old fig tree. He documented dreams, prophecies, arguments, and silences. Nothing was too small. That was what Dion had taught him. Memory is made of fragments, not declarations. He carved symbols into the threshold of the temple. A circle within a square, flanked by 4 lines: sun, earth, wind, and word. When asked, he would only say, "It means we're still here." In the winters they told longer stories. The nights were too bitter for sleep, so they would gather by the stone fire pit in the main hall, wrapped in furs and layered cloth. They passed down the tale of the year the sun disappeared, of the man who buried the boy beneath the nameless tree, of the woman who refused to let the words vanish with the wind. Children, wide-eyed and silent, soaked in these tales like roots in water. They asked the same questions again and again. Did the sun really go away? Was there really no color? Did people forget how to sing? And always the answer was the same: yes, but not forever. A girl named Lyra, no older than 10, once asked, "Will it happen again?" The question fell heavy into the fire-warmed silence. No one answered immediately. Finally, Orion said, "Everything happens again. That's why we write it down." As decades passed, the people of the outer regions began to speak of the temple in reverent tones. They gave it names it had never asked for: the Hall of the Rememberers, the Temple of the Ash Sun, the Keep of Words. They sent gifts, requests, and sometimes questions. A wandering prince once arrived with his guards, asking if he might find in their scrolls a prophecy about a second eclipse. Orion gave him tea and showed him the oldest records, but the prince left dissatisfied. He had not come seeking memory, only magic. But others came seeking truth. A woman with burns on her hands who had lived through a firestorm in the west. A blind shepherd who had memorized the ancient poems of a lost river people. A boy who had never heard silence because the wind in his valley never stopped howling. They all came, and they all added to the archive, not always in ink but in voice, in memory, in the way they saw the world. Orion grew older. His back bent and his eyes dimmed, but he kept a sharpness in his voice that softened only when he spoke of the garden. He no longer tended it with his own hands, but he would sit on the bench near the olive tree and guide the young ones. "Roots before blossoms," he'd say. "Don't trust early fruit. And never water when the moon is red." When he could no longer walk the hall, they carried him in a chair. He continued writing until the joints of his fingers swelled too stiff to hold the stylus. Then he dictated. They gave him a boy with quick ears and quicker hands to be his shadow. His name was Junis. He never spoke when Orion was speaking and never interrupted a story. One day, during a long spring with thick rains, Junis asked, "Master, do you think Cashin knew what would happen?" Orion looked out across the garden, where the fig tree was in bloom again. He said, "I think Cashin didn't need to know. He believed that remembering was enough." Junis thought on that a long time and never asked again. When Orion died, they buried him next to Dion and Cashin beneath the same fig tree. 3 stones stood now, simple, unmarked, but for the same symbol carved on each: the half-sun eclipsed by ash. Junis took his place, and so it continued. The world beyond the temple was not always kind. New wars rose from old hatreds. Floods came. A sickness swept through the eastern ports and burned out before it could cross the mountain passes. But always people returned to the temple. For stories. For shelter. For the quiet dignity of being remembered. Generations passed. The temple expanded not by brick but by memory. More scrolls. More stories. More names whispered aloud so they would not be forgotten. The symbols spread. Painted on doors, carved into tools, sewn into cloaks. It meant many things to many people now. To some it meant survival. To others it meant reverence. But to those who knew its origin it simply meant, we endured. And still, on certain evenings when the sky was clear and the wind moved through the rafters with the hush of old breath, someone would sit beneath the olive tree, open a scroll, and begin to read. Not for glory, not for gods, but because the stories had to live, because the worst year to be alive had not ended life, and because even in the darkest time, someone had remembered how to write. Junis, who had been a boy of questions and quick hands, grew into a man of silence and steady eyes. The scrolls written under his care multiplied beyond what any one person could read in a lifetime. He organized them not by name, but by season, by wind, by the scent of the earth when the words were written. He said this was the only honest way to store a memory, not by what it meant to others, but by what the world felt like when it arrived. He taught students never more than 5 at a time. "Any more," he'd say, "and you start reciting instead of listening." His students were not chosen by strength, nor wit, nor age. He chose them the way a tree chooses branches, by direction, by balance, by feel. One was the daughter of a far-seeing woman who lived alone in the northern cliffs and spoke to the sky like a friend. Another was a boy who had no tongue, but whose hands moved like water over parchment. There was an old man who came not to learn but to remember the name of his son, long dead. He found it, one winter evening, buried in a scroll written by Dion herself. He died a month later with a smile. Junies wrote little in his own name. He believed his purpose was to carry stories, not to add to them. But every so often after midnight, when the temple was quiet and the olive leaves tapped gently against the shutters, he would unroll a small piece of parchment and add a few lines. He never read these aloud. He tucked them in a box beneath the fig tree, wrapped in linen soaked in olive oil to keep the mold away. No one else knew about them until much later, long after Junies had gone to lie beside Orion and Dion and Cassian, whose names were now spoken like the roots of a language. The temple grew moss on its northern side. The wind carved grooves into the outer walls, like scripture etched by time itself. The garden expanded. What had once been a patch of herbs was now an entire slope of trees and wild vegetables, tended by those who came to offer work in exchange for rest. The fig tree bore fruit that tasted like memory, sweet but with a bitterness that lingered. No one ruled the temple. No one ever had. There were no masters, no abbots, no kings. It ruled itself through the rhythm of story and the stubborn devotion of those who remembered. People came not to ask what had happened in the past, but to be part of it, to add a thread to the cloth, a mark on the scroll, a voice to the wind. They brought music, strange and ancient, with drums made from whale skin and flutes carved from bone. They brought fabrics dyed in lost colors, the red of lightning over salt plains, the blue of mountain dusk, the green of moss after rain. One summer, during a year when the sun seemed brighter than it had in memory, a woman arrived with a child wrapped in reed cloth. The woman spoke no language any recognized, but her eyes told stories of fire and loss. The child never spoke, never laughed, but one morning he wandered into the garden and began arranging stones in a spiral, a perfect, endless line that never touched itself. Junies' successor, a sharp-minded woman named Lyra, watched in silence. When the child finished, she wept. They let the spiral remain. Lyra had a voice like gravel and a mind like a blade. She restored the collapsed eastern wing of the temple not to its old shape, but into an open hall without a roof, where stories could be told beneath the stars. She declared that silence was sacred, but also that silence must end eventually, or else it drowns what lives inside. She encouraged those who came to speak even when their voices shook. "Better a broken word than a perfect lie," she said once to a young scribe who had thrown away 5 pages of trembling confession. During her years, a stranger came bearing a single leaf. It was unlike any tree they knew, veined with gold, shaped like a flame. The stranger said it grew from a place where the clouds kissed the ground, and the air itself shimmered with memory. Lyra planted the leaf, not expecting anything, but each year it sent up a single new sprout. It never bore fruit, never flowered, but the sprouts glowed faintly in moonlight, and they whispered when the wind passed over them. People claimed to hear different things. Some heard lost songs. Some heard names they hadn't spoken in decades. Some, like Lyra, heard nothing. And yet she sat by the tree often, as if its silence was enough. In time the scrolls outnumbered the people. They were kept in great clay vaults beneath the garden, in airless chambers sealed with beeswax and lined with cypress. The writing never stopped. Children who had never seen famine still asked about the year the sun went out. Elders who had never lived through fire still wept at the mention of the boy beneath the fig tree. The temple had become more than a place. It was a long breath held between disaster and hope, between the world that was and the one that might be again. And always, always the stories continued. New voices, new hands, old truths, forgotten sorrows rediscovered like relics in dust. Through it all, the symbol remained, the half-sun eclipsed but rising, a promise etched in ash, a memory that refused to die. There came a year when the rains did not stop. It began with a soft drizzle in the season of planting, welcome and expected. But the drizzle thickened into downpour, and the downpour became a curtain of water that hung between sky and earth without pause. Streams overflowed and became rivers, rivers swelled and swallowed roads, and the earth itself softened into a kind of soup, swallowing the footprints of those who passed through it. Fields drowned, young plants turned pale and dissolved into mud. Even the olive tree at the heart of the temple garden leaned with unease. The vaults beneath the temple threatened to flood. The clay walls wept moisture, and the oldest scrolls, those first written by Cashin, the fragile ones Dion had bound with the thread of her own cloak, began to sag under the weight of damp air. Alarm spread not in shouts or panic but in tight-lipped glances, in hands that moved faster, in the soft rush of cloth as scrolls were wrapped and moved to higher ground. The keepers formed a circle in the courtyard, the rain soaking their cloaks, pooling in the folds of their sleeves and dripping from their brows like tears. Lyra, now stooped with age and wrapped in a cloak as blue as a bruised sky, spoke without raising her voice. "If we lose the words, we lose the map," she said. "The world forgets itself." So they moved the scrolls. One by one, page by page, they brought them into the high halls, drying each with care, reading fragments aloud as they did. Even the unreadable pages were spoken, torn symbols, ink-smudged names, lines half lost to mold, all spoken, all remembered. Children were enlisted not for their strength but their steadiness. Elders recalled the shapes of letters they hadn't traced in decades. Some scrolls disintegrated in their hands. When they did, a scribe would whisper its last line aloud so it would not vanish entirely. The rain did not care. It kept falling. Roofs leaked. Bread molded. Fires refused to stay lit. But the stories endured. When the waters finally receded, it was not triumph that followed, but exhaustion. The temple grounds had become a marsh, and the garden a sodden mirror of what it had been. The olive tree had survived, though much of its bark had split. The tree of flame leaves, the one planted from the stranger's golden-veined leaf, had grown. Not taller, but deeper, its roots exposed like fingers grasping the earth's bones. Lyra did not live to see the dry season return. She died in her sleep beneath the vaults, surrounded by scrolls, her fingers curled around a stylus that had long run out of ink. They buried her beneath the stone bench where she had taught the children to listen to silence. Her name was etched into a single slab of slate, not with letters, but with a line that began and ended in the shape of a closed eye. Her successor was not chosen by vote or by lineage, but by the quiet assent of those who remained. A young woman named Tamri, whose voice had once been too quiet to carry across the fire pit, now spoke with a steadiness that did not seek permission. She found strength not in the words she spoke but in her need to speak them. Her first act was to declare the temple open to all who had lost names to the water. Refugees came, not soldiers, not lords, but wanderers. They came carrying soaked satchels, infants, folded maps that no longer matched the shape of the world. Tamri gave them bread, dry blankets, and when they were ready, a place to speak. Many could not write, so the scribes became their hands. They inked stories told in sobs, in broken phrases, in gestures made by those whose languages had no written form. These stories joined the archive, side by side with the oldest scrolls. One boy arrived with nothing but a small jar sealed with wax. When asked what it contained, he said, "Pi Village." Inside was a single page, written in charcoal, the letters smeared from moisture. No one could read it. Tamri placed it in the Hall of the Lost and wrote his name beside it, not on paper but in the woven tapestries that lined the southern walls. A new practice she began for names too young or too broken to hold ink. The temple's role shifted again. It was no longer only a place of memory, but of refuge and rebirth. Music returned, slow at first, just humming in the garden as seeds were planted again. Then came the drums, and the flutes carved from hollow reeds, and the voices lifted in harmony that did not ask to be perfect, only shared. The olive tree bore fruit once more. The fig tree sprouted new leaves. The scrolls, now countless, filled halls, shelves, caskets, and walls. Some were copied onto stone for permanence. Others were recited each month beneath the stars in the open sky hall, where no roof separated their voices from the wind. There was no longer anyone living who remembered the year 536, not by their own eyes or breath. But the story remained. It lived in the songs, in the mural painted on the northern wall, which showed the sun bleeding over a field of ash and 3 figures walking away from the ruins with scrolls tied to their backs. It lived in the names spoken before sleep, in the rituals of planting, in the careful way people now paused before cutting a tree as if asking permission. It lived in the tradition of the 3 lamps, still lit every evening, one for the dead, one for the living, and one for what was yet to be understood. Tamri aged in time, her voice softening but never fading. When she grew tired, she rested beneath the flame-leaf tree, now tall enough to shade the whole northern courtyard. Its leaves still glowed and still whispered. She claimed she could hear Lyra's breath in them, and sometimes a child's laughter, and once, just once, a man's voice reciting a poem no one else knew. And always the writing continued, because in a world once drowned in shadow, remembering was a kind of light. Seasons rolled forward, unspooling like ribbon from the spools of time, and under their constant turning, the temple grew into a place that no longer belonged to one age but to all of them. Travelers who arrived with nothing left behind, fragments of themselves. A story here, a carved token on a windowsill there, a song that echoed for a year before drifting into the collective hum of the place. Children born within its walls grew up beneath the rustling of scrolls and the sound of voices reading aloud at dusk. They learned early that history did not lie buried in the past, but lived and breathed beside them in every silence, every name, every remembered line. Tamri's final days passed without spectacle. She aged into stillness, her hands folded calmly over her lap as others read to her. She listened without judgment, smiling faintly when a voice faltered, always encouraging those whose memories tangled or stammered. Her mind remained sharp, her gaze clear. When she died, surrounded by the voices of her people and the soft rustle of parchment, the temple did not hold mourning in the way others might. Instead, they spent 3 nights reading only her favorite stories aloud. On the 4th, they planted a row of fig trees beside the flame-leafed one. They called them Tamri's ears, saying they would always be listening. From there, time became layers. A winter arrived colder than most in living memory, and with it came a group of desert people carrying bundles of dried herbs and thick-woven cloaks the color of sandstone. Their language had no word for sun, only for light that waits. They shared stories that described the stars as tears shed by the earth during the long darkness, and their stories found new life among the temple's younger storytellers. When they left in spring, they gifted the temple a long piece of silk, upon which had been embroidered a single line in golden thread: "We are what we do with our silence." Years later, an earthquake cracked the southern vaults. Scrolls were nearly lost, but a girl no older than 12 braved the trembling stone and rescued a chest sealed with ash and beeswax. Inside were the last writings of Orion, still fragrant with the scent of olive wood. For this act, she was given no title, only a place to sit among the elders and the simple honor of reading one of his scrolls each year during the night of the fallen walls, when all in the temple stayed awake to remember the fragility of structure and the endurance of words. Storms came and went. New names etched into stone joined the old ones. Festivals were born, not out of conquest or kingship, but in remembrance of the things that had nearly been lost. There was the festival of first smoke, marking the first rekindling of fire after the rains had drowned the coals. The festival of soft feet, honoring those who had come in silence and added their memory without ever needing to speak. The long bell, rung only when a language was thought to have disappeared, its toll followed by a day of silence, a day of teaching and a day of song, hoping to revive what had been forgotten. Some generations passed like leaves on water, quiet and uneventful. Others arrived with fire in their eyes. seekers of knowledge who tore apart scrolls to rebuild them, who questioned the past not to dishonor it but to sharpen it. One young boy uncovered discrepancies in the early scrolls, discovering that the date of the great eclipse might have been miscounted by a full year. Rather than dismiss his findings, the temple honored him with a thread of black sewn into the hem of his robe, not a mark of shame but a symbol of shadow, the necessary companion of light. The flame-leaf tree became known as the Whispering Root. By now, it had stretched into a towering presence in the garden, taller than the olive or fig trees, with roots that reached deep into the vaults. People swore they still heard things in its leaves. Not voices this time, but pulses, rhythms, as if the world's oldest heartbeat had found a home in its sap. At some point, a wandering mason, old and bent, with eyes milky from age, came to the temple. He offered to carve their story in stone, not in letters but in images. Over 20 years he etched a spiraling mural along the outer wall, depicting the world's darkness, the extinguished sun, the burial of the child beneath the nameless tree, and the rising of the scrolls from ash and water and silence. It wrapped around the temple like a shell, a spiral that led inward to a single blank space, untouched. When asked why he left it blank, the mason simply said, "That is the part that has not yet been lived." And so the temple continued. It was never the center of the world, never a place of wealth or empire. It stood off the roads, away from the cities, on ground where ash once fell like snow and people once prayed for light. But in its walls lived voices. In its soil grew memory. And in its people, scribes and wanderers, weepers and singers, those who stayed and those who only passed through, history was no longer something that happened to them. It was something they became. One evening, many years after Tamri's death, a traveler arrived from across the sea. He carried with him a single sentence, carved into driftwood and worn smooth by salt and wind. No one could read it at first. Its symbols were old, older even than those in the earliest vaults. But eventually, a blind scribe recognized the pattern, a language passed down in rhythmic chants, preserved only in tone. They deciphered the sentence. It said, "Even the dark remembers the light." The traveler stayed for a week, planted a seed beside the Whispering Root, and left without a name. The seed grew. The stories never stopped. And the temple, like time itself, endured. The seed the traveler left did not resemble anything known to the temple's gardeners. It was black and oblong, polished like river stone, and smooth as a drop of cooled glass. It gave off no scent, responded to no water or warmth, and for days it simply rested in the soil beside the Whispering Root, unmoving. Many assumed it would rot and disappear as the sea's tokens often did. But on the 13th night, under a moon veiled in cloud, the seed split. It made no sound when it did, but those who passed the garden the next morning said the air smelled faintly of wind over snow, though it was midsummer. From the broken shell rose a slender shoot with a single silver leaf. It did not shimmer, it did not glow, but it bent ever so slightly toward the west, toward the direction from which the traveler had come. Over the months that followed, the shoot grew faster than any in memory. It curled upward like smoke, gaining thickness, and sent out roots that knotted around the stones bordering the Whispering Root as though reaching for memory itself. Children began sitting beneath its shadow. They said it made them dream strange dreams, not frightening ones, but vivid, filled with shapes and songs they did not recognize but somehow understood. One child, barely old enough to speak in full sentences, began drawing spiral patterns into the dust with his fingers after sitting under the silver-leaf tree. The same spiral seen in the outer temple's mural, the same shape once traced by the child who had arrived in silence after the long darkness. It was as if the memory of the world had begun folding in on itself, not in confusion but in echo. The elders debated whether the tree was meant as a message or simply a continuation. One of the oldest scribes, her hair white as the scroll parchment and her fingers twisted from years of writing, believed the tree was memory itself, memory grown tired of ink, choosing instead to root itself where no hand could misplace it. Another argued it was the future planted too early, a sign the world's rhythm was shifting once more. Still, no name was given to the tree. It was not yet ready. In the temple, names were never forced. They arrived in time, shaped by what people saw and felt and whispered in passing. So the tree stood tall, nameless and silver-leaved, a sentinel beside the whispering root, and slowly the air around it grew quieter. Not with fear, but with listening. Visitors from distant lands continued to arrive, some bearing broken instruments from fallen cities, others with worn pages from libraries swallowed by fire or sea. Each offering was accepted, restored where possible, and then stored, not for preservation but for resurrection. The temple had long since abandoned the idea of holding knowledge as if it were gold. Instead, it was treated as a seed, something to be planted, tended, shared. A traveling singer once asked why the temple hadn't fallen into the hands of kings or burnt to ash by those who feared remembering. A scribe replied, "Because we never closed our doors. You do not burn what welcomes you." And yet shadows still came. Not all who sought knowledge did so in reverence. One day, a man cloaked in red arrived with a voice like honeyed rust and a scroll bound in serpent hide. He spoke of gathering the temple's scrolls into a single tome, the book of all that survived, he called it, and taking it to the courts of rulers, that they might rule with memory instead of ignorance. He claimed it was for the good of all, that the age of quiet remembering had passed. The temple listened. Then an old woman, blind but sure-footed, stood beside the flame-leaf tree and said, "If you compress memory into one voice, it forgets how to sing. No one song can hold the storm, the fig, the silence, and the scream." The man left. Years passed. The temple's walls, now covered in ivy and etched with hundreds of unnamed symbols, fragments from lost tongues, remembered only in gesture or breath, had begun to crack in places. Not from neglect, but from the pressure of time itself. No one sought to rebuild them. Instead, people carved prayers into the splits, filling the breaks with words and pigment, so that even the fractures became stories. The vaults beneath the earth, once sealed with wax and lined with clay, had become too vast to navigate without the help of the vault walkers, young initiates trained to move through the dark with breath and finger, knowing which scrolls sang of wind and which smelled of blood or winter or morning. The walkers knew that touching the wrong scroll in haste could crumble it, that breathing too hard could scatter entire lives. But they also knew how to recite from memory the words of the vanished, how to coax stories back into daylight, and how to weave new ones when fragments alone remained. In time, a new ritual was born. Once a year, on the night of the heaviest moon, all torches in the temple were extinguished. The people gathered in the open sky hall, and for one full night no words were spoken. Only the sound of wind in the trees, the soft shift of fabric, the distant rustle of parchment, the occasional breath caught in the throat. The ritual came to be known as the listening night, and it was said that on that night the temple itself whispered, not in any one voice, but in all the voices that had ever passed through it. Many claimed they heard nothing. Others claimed they heard everything. The silver-leaf tree grew broader. Its roots pushed through flagstones and touched the bones of the oldest vaults. Some feared it would break the foundation. Others said it was becoming the foundation. Birds began nesting in its limbs, birds no one had names for, whose feathers shimmered like smoke and whose calls mimicked the laughter of children or the rising rhythm of a chant. And still the stories came. One by one, line by line, scribbled on leaves, whispered into cloth, inked with crushed berries, burned into wood, woven into braids, hummed into jars and sealed for future ears. A world once covered in ash had become a garden of memory, not because the darkness had ended, but because those who remembered had learned to plant it, to root it, to make it grow. The garden around the temple grew dense with symbols. Not the orderly symbols of scholars or the tidy glyphs of old alphabets, but shapes born from impulse and memory, spirals drawn into wet soil, triangles marked on stones, wave patterns carved onto clay dishes, sunburst strokes painted in ochre on the backs of doors, The temple had become something more than an archive. It was a living echo not just of one age or people, but of all those who had come and left pieces of themselves in its soil and walls. The silver-leaf tree, which had once seemed so young beside the ancient whispering root, now towered with a presence not of domination, but of quiet magnetism. Its leaves never faded with season. Instead, they changed color with emotion. Green when laughter was shared beneath it, silver when songs were sung, blue when morning passed through its roots, and violet when someone stood beneath it in silence, searching for words they could not find. Some began to believe that the tree did not just record emotion, it remembered it. One child, a girl who had never spoken, came daily to sit at its base. She would touch the bark and hum tuneless notes, and each day the leaves above her would tremble, shift color, and fall one by one around her in a ring. She came every year, and every year more leaves responded. The elders eventually gave her a role without a name. She became a keeper of feeling, the kind of historian who never needed ink. One night, during the season of broken light, when the moon vanished behind the storms and the stars refused to show, a great wind tore through the western wall. Stones crashed, scrolls scattered, and the olive tree that had stood for generations split at the center with a sound like bone cracking in winter. No one spoke for 3 days, not from fear but reverence. When they gathered again, they did not rebuild the wall. They left it open, facing the horizon. The olive tree was buried upright, roots in the air, branches in the soil, a gesture toward everything that had once seemed permanent but had given way to change. Afterward, a new kind of writing emerged, not only on scrolls or stones or skin, but on the wind. Scribes began composing verses that were meant to be spoken once and never again. They believed that not all stories needed preservation. Some were meant to die in the moment of their telling, like seeds that flowered and faded in a single breath. These were called drift words, and only the wind readers could create them. They walked into the empty places outside the temple, the dry fields, the broken roads, the ash-covered ruins where no one else lingered, and there they spoke the verses aloud. The wind carried them. Sometimes, someone would hear a word days later, whispered through a crack in a window or between the cry of birds. When that happened, they would write it down and place it in the box of returning. The box was always unlocked. More years passed, and the temple's youngest began adding their own rituals. One group started tying feathers to doorposts in the color of their favorite memory. Another carved soft flutes from reeds and left them in random corners so that wind might sing through them. A third group created a game where players would draw random symbols from a bag and invent stories around them. A lion, a wave, a broken circle, a hand reaching. Some of these games lasted days, circling back into myths so rich they became part of the temple's official teachings. No one ruled the temple. That was the oldest truth. There were those who tended it, who organized, who remembered where each vault twisted and which stone cracked when stepped on too heavily. But no single voice ever became the voice. It was the breath of many that gave the place its rhythm, and that rhythm had no conductor, only participants. Some days the temple felt still, as if the weight of memory pressed down too hard. On such days, the scribes would open the northern gates and let strangers lead the reading. A farmer with sunburned hands recited a poem about soil remembering footsteps. A widow whispered the names of every bird her husband had imitated. A prisoner who had walked for 6 days without food told a story about how silence sounded different after grief. These stories, too, were inscribed, not into scrolls, but onto plates of woven bark stored near the silver-leaf tree. It was said the tree responded more strongly to those. Eventually the tree flowered. No one saw it begin. One morning, the branches were simply heavy with blossoms, hundreds of them, shaped like eyes, soft to the touch and pulsing faintly with light. The petals held warmth, and when they fell, they did not wither. Instead, they turned to glass, thin, smoky ovals that rang softly when struck together. These petals were gathered carefully, and those who wore them said they dreamed of lives not their own. A young man claimed he saw the moment the sun disappeared in 536. He He described it as though he were there. The way the shadows stretched wrong, the way even birds stopped flying, the way people looked up not in awe, but in confusion that curdled into dread. Another woman dreamed of a child standing before the first vault, clutching a scroll that bled ink onto her arms, her feet bare and caked in ash. The petals became relics, but not sacred. No object in the temple was considered divine, only reflective. The temple had no gods, but it had memory. And memory, they said, required care greater than worship. As the silver-leafed tree grew, its roots sank into the stories beneath the earth. Its branches grew so broad that they covered the southern courtyard, creating a kind of twilight where only filtered light passed through the leaf glass. The scribes named this space the Chamber of Almost Light. Here stories were whispered, not spoken, told so softly that only those willing to lean close could hear them. In time, the temple became less a place and more a rhythm. People born far away spoke of it without having been there. They said it was a temple, but not a temple. A garden, but not only for plants. A vault, but one that sang. They passed down stories that might have originated in its halls, or might have simply been drawn toward its gravity. Not even the keepers could say which was true anymore. Some stories returned in different forms. Others had changed so much they became new seeds. But no one questioned this. That was memory's way. And still, above the courtyard, the silver-leafed tree bloomed. Each new blossom was not a repetition but a variation. Some took the shape of hands open in offering, others resembled the curve of a listening ear, and some bloomed in utter silence, their petals drawn inward like thought held in a breath. The tree no longer stood alone. From its seeds, which had begun to fall only in the final years of the fourth generation of temple caretakers, others had started to grow in hidden corners of the world. Not in gardens, but in unlikely places, between the ribs of broken statues, in crevices of ruined libraries, beside wells whose waters reflected no sky. Travelers began arriving with leaves from trees no one at the temple had ever planted. One bore a branch wrapped in linen, its leaves red as fire, yet cold to the touch. Another brought a tiny sapling with thorns like glass and a root shaped like a sleeping serpent. A third carried only a whisper, claiming it had been spoken to her by a tree that burned but did not die. The caretakers accepted each with equal care, not as miracles but as replies. Memory, it seemed, had learned how to answer. One night, during the longest rain in half a century, the wind carried a song no one recognized. It didn't come from a mouth, but from the earth itself. It reverberated through the vaults, echoed in the bones of the oldest scrolls, and caused the ink on the newest pages to ripple, shimmer, rearrange. When the storm ended, one of the vault walkers discovered that entire sections of a forgotten language had reappeared on pages thought blank. The words translated loosely to, "We were never gone. We simply waited until the world could listen again." After that, the temple's work changed. It no longer saw itself only as a guardian of the past, but as a translator of returning voices. The scribes trained their ears to listen to places: cliffs, caves, ruins, empty marketplaces, riverbeds long dry. They said that memory was not confined to scrolls or minds but moved through the world like weather, and that each person was a vessel that caught fragments in passing. Some began crafting instruments made not to be played but to be tuned to memory. These tools did not produce music but vibrations, low hums, clicks, or brief bursts of heat and scent. One device, shaped like a spiral conch, released the smell of applewood and blood when held in moonlight, and it was said this was the exact memory of a single moment: a boy carrying his wounded brother through the smoke of a ruined orchard. The boy's name was lost, but the feeling was remembered, and still the silver-leafed tree grew. It was taller now than the southern wall, its upper limbs stretching toward stars with names only the skywatchers knew. Some believed the tree's canopy had begun to influence dreams beyond the temple, that even those who had never seen it began to dream in its shade. In distant cities, strangers woke with fragments of forgotten songs on their tongues. Others described a tree of light that spoke without words, offering images instead. A flood frozen in time, a mother clutching a broken pot, a bird flying into ash, and a hand emerging from a pile of bones with a sprig of green held between its fingers. Scholars tried to catalog these dreams, but they defied the order of logic. The more they were recorded, the more they changed, as if being looked at bent them slightly like light through imperfect glass. One elder finally said, "Let them drift. They are not ours to hold, only ours to witness." In the heart of the temple, a space was created not for knowledge but for forgetting. A quiet room with no scrolls, no names, no carvings. Only cushions, running water, and a single silver bell. It was said that in this room memories let go of you if you allowed them. Not because they were unworthy, but because they had done their work. The bell rang when someone was released. Some never returned after entering. They were not mourned. They were understood. The temple changed again. It had once been stone and scroll, then root and bloom, then word and wind. Now it became something softer, harder to name. A rhythm that echoed even when unspoken. A warmth that lingered without fire. A place you could find even with closed eyes. It was not a destination, but a question. And still the silver-leaf tree bloomed. Its blossoms, once rare, now fell daily. People caught them in their hands, tied them into their hair, buried them beneath stones, or let them drift into rivers. Children played beneath its branches and invented languages only the tree seemed to understand. Birds returned, strange birds, silent ones, nesting in the branches and laying eggs that shimmered like molten dusk. When the eggs hatched, the birds sang only once before flying away. It was said that wherever they flew, memory followed. One day, beneath a sky the color of bruised copper, an old man with eyes clouded by time stood beneath the tree and wept. Not from sorrow, but because he had remembered something beautiful too late to share. The tree bent slightly toward him. He pressed his forehead to its bark. When he stepped back, a new root had emerged from the soil, curling gently in his direction. He died that night peacefully. Where he was buried, another sapling began to grow, not silver-leaved but with dark wine-colored fronds that shimmered only in shadow. No one named this tree either, but they left offerings beside it. Feathers, whispered secrets, pieces of broken glass gathered from forgotten places. The temple, if it was still a temple, no longer told people how to remember. It simply offered space, and silence, and stories, some lasting a breath, others unfurling like a river with no mouth. And still, above the courtyard, the silver-leafed tree bloomed. Its blossoms had begun to fall more slowly now, each drifting like a thought descending gently into sleep. The air beneath its canopy had grown stiller, as if time itself hesitated in that space, lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Pilgrims who arrived from across the mountains or from salt cities beside the oceans began to speak of the hush beneath the tree not as silence, but as presence, as if the tree was listening, watching, remembering with them. Some no longer spoke at all when they entered the garden. They simply sat, breathed, and listened in return. There were those who came bearing songs from cities that no longer existed. The notes they sang wavered with age, notes passed through generations on wind-torn tongues. One woman carried a melody so old it made even the petals quiver. She claimed it had no origin, that it had lived inside a cave humming from the rocks, long before the first city burned. When she sang beneath the tree, a new blossom opened in silence and drifted down into her hands. She did not weep, nor bow, nor speak. She simply pressed the blossom to her chest and left. The temple's oldest caretaker, a woman with fingers like roots and eyes dulled by too many sunsets, began to walk the halls less and less. Instead, she sat with the tree each morning and let it shade her thoughts. Her presence was enough to remind others to speak softly. When asked what she thought the tree meant, she always replied the same: "It remembers more than we've forgotten." That is enough. But not all who arrived sought peace. One day, riders came with banners stained in soot, with armor clinking like bones and breath sharp from long wars. They spoke in harsh tongues, demanding to see the source of power hidden within the temple. The scribes did not argue. They only led them through the garden and into the chamber where the silver-leaf tree stood in eternal bloom. The writers laughed, expecting relics or weapons. When shown only roots, blossoms, and silence, they grew angry. One struck the tree with the flat of his blade. The blade shattered. He stared at the jagged hilt, then at the branch he'd meant to wound. It hadn't cracked or splintered, but the wind changed. The leaves above rustled in a pattern that no one present could explain, and suddenly every rider's horse reared violently outside the walls. The men fled without words, dropping weapons and banners as they ran. The tree remained still afterward as if nothing had happened, but a single dark blossom, black with veins of red, grew at the place where the blade had touched. It fell 3 days later and was never found. The scribes did not speak of it again. Some truths, they said, were not for the vaults. In the years that followed, the temple's outer halls began to erode. Not from time, but from a kind of soft surrender. The stones loosened gently, their carvings worn smooth by wind and moss. The murals faded, not from neglect, but from being remembered too well. The images no longer needed to remain visible, for they lived fully in those who had seen them. Rooms collapsed with grace, leaving behind open courts filled with grasses, flowers, and small insects that whispered against the stone. The line between structure and earth blurred until only the inner sanctum, the garden, and the tree remained truly untouched. Children were born beneath its canopy. They were marked not by bloodlines but by memory itself. Some bore patterns on their skin that mirrored ancient glyphs lost to fire. Others spoke in languages they had never been taught, only to forget them by adolescence. One boy could hear the names of birds before they landed. One girl could walk through dreams not her own. They were not considered holy. They were loved and listened to and treated as reminders that the past was not a prison but a river, sometimes branching, sometimes returning. The old caretakers faded. Some walked into the forest and were not seen again. Some sat beneath the tree until the blossoms gathered around their stillness like snow. New caretakers emerged without being named. A potter who never wrote a word but shaped cups that always fit the hand. A boy who recited forgotten proverbs at sunset, never twice the same. A blind woman who sat with strangers and told them dreams they hadn't shared aloud. And all the while, the silver-leaf tree continued to bloom. Its petals now drifted farther, caught in high winds, carried over mountains, across rivers, into caves and cellars and the corners of broken homes. One was found in a ruined theater, pressed between the pages of a script no one could read. Another appeared in a temple of ice, melting the snow around it into a pool that smelled of lemon and smoke. Still others turned up in boxes buried deep beneath cities, wrapped in silk beside bones. They were not sacred, these petals, but they were remembered. Somewhere far from the temple, a woman who had never heard of it woke from a dream with one such petal clutched in her fist. She didn't know where it had come from, but she placed it on her windowsill, and every morning it turned slightly toward the sun. And still, in the garden that was once a vault, once a library, once a ruin, once a question, the silver-leaf tree bloomed. The blooming never ceased, though seasons changed, and the world beyond the old temple pulsed with its own rhythms of birth and loss. The petals of the silver-leaf tree had grown softer over time, thinner than paper, yet they held their shape even in rain and heat and wind. They no longer needed to be touched to be understood. People who sat quietly beneath the tree sometimes felt entire lifetimes drift past them with the passing of a single blossom, not their own lives, but others, long buried, long unspoken. It was not always easy. Some petals carried sorrow so heavy that even the strongest wept. Others, though, sparked laughter so deep it left people breathless, clutching their stomachs as if joy itself had surprised them. No one claimed ownership of the petals. They were not kept. When they fell, they were caught, felt, and released. The ground beneath the tree became a river of fallen memory, and it was said the soil grew rich with the stories it swallowed. Moss there glowed faintly at night, and insects that had no names before began to appear, small and luminous, singing soft clicks that matched the heartbeat of the earth. One night, during the reign of golden fire, a meteor storm that streaked across the sky in such vast silence it made even the owls forget to call, the tree shifted. Not with wind, not with age. It simply adjusted as though waking. A new branch emerged from its heart, not rising upward but downward, reaching gently into the earth like a returning limb. It did not disturb the roots. It sank beside them, entwined like a returning twin. The next morning, children discovered a tunnel beneath the roots. It wasn't dark. It glowed faintly with light not from fire or sun, but from the air itself. A dim, bluish warmth like the inside of a forgotten dream. It was not deep, only enough to walk for a minute or two, and it opened into a small chamber of stone that had not been carved, but grown, as if the earth itself had decided to make space. On the walls were no markings, no stories, no carvings, just smooth, cool surfaces and a single stone basin filled with water that reflected not one's face, but memories not yet made. When the first to look into it emerged, they said nothing for days. When they finally spoke, all they said was, "It showed me the world if we forget to remember." After that, only a few chose to enter, and none twice. Above, the tree continued to bloom. By now, the people who came to the temple were not pilgrims. They were not seekers. They were simply people. Some brought broken things, clocks that never ticked, fragments of letters written in lost alphabets, buttons from coats never worn. They would bury these gently in the garden, not as offerings, but as acknowledgments. This mattered once, and now it rests. Others came only to sit, and in sitting they became part of the garden. A man who had once been a soldier, who had never spoken of the children he left behind, lay down beneath the tree and slept for 3 days. When he woke, he said the tree had told him the names of his grandchildren. He repeated them once, then never again. That night, a cluster of new blossoms bloomed in a tight spiral, 5 with edges the color of firelit dusk. A woman who had spent her life drawing maps came and laid her last scroll beneath the tree. The scroll contained no roads, no mountains, no borders. Only a spiral that led to a small, still point in the center. Beneath it she had written, "Here where memory listens." When she left, the scroll remained. A root crept over it in the weeks that followed, not to cover it, but to cradle it. And so the garden continued. The tree did not stop blooming in lands far from the temple. Rumors grew of other trees, cousins perhaps, or echoes, each different. One with leaves shaped like tears that whispered songs in the rain. Another with bark that shimmered with faces from long ago. A third that grew alone in a cave of ice, its blossoms glowing only when touched by shadow. No one knew if they were born from the silver-leaf tree or if they had simply always been there, waiting to be found when the world became quiet enough again. And still the silver-leaf tree bloomed. When the oldest of the caretakers finally lay beneath it for the last time, the petals did not fall quickly. They circled her slowly like a dance and came to rest gently on her closed eyes, her folded hands. She had never written her own name. She had once said, "If the tree remembers me, that is enough." When she passed, the wind blew soft and steady through the garden, and the tree dropped a single blossom the color of deep mourning. No one picked it up. It drifted, settled in the stream behind the temple, and floated away. By then, the temple itself had almost disappeared, not destroyed, not abandoned, but worn back into the earth like a well-loved stone. What remained were the gardens, the tree, and the paths worn by footsteps that had never been recorded. Birds still came. Wind still carried words. Children still made games from pebbles and laughter and shadows. And through it all, the silver-leaf tree bloomed, never stopping, never rushing, as if it understood something no voice could ever say, as if it was not a tree at all, but the long, quiet breath of history itself, gentle, endless, and always unfolding. There were years when no one came at all. No footsteps stirred the pathways, No hands reached to catch the falling petals, no voices murmured beneath the vast canopy. The garden grew wild in places, ivy creeping along the stones, flowers unknown even to the oldest names bursting through the soil in fragrant, chaotic waves. The tree did not mind. It waited. It always waited. One winter, the longest in memory, snow fell without pause for 60 days. The world beyond the temple vanished beneath white silence. And yet within the garden, the tree stood bare of snow. Its leaves, though cold to the touch, never withered. Its roots, deep in memory-rich soil, gave off a faint warmth. And in the quiet, a pair of foxes came to nest beneath its branches. Their den was dug beside the root that curled like a question, the one that had once emerged for a dying man who remembered too late. The foxes raised 3 kits there, and each bore a single silver mark behind the ear. The caretakers, those few who still kept watch from afar, said nothing but nodded slowly when they heard. In time, those foxes became part of the memory too. Travelers began to return, but differently. Not in search of answers, not as seekers of wisdom or pilgrims of the past. They came as listeners. They came to sit in the stillness and share what they carried. Not scrolls, not relics, but feelings too long held. A woman whispered her grief into the bark, and days later she returned to find a petal shaped like her mother's necklace. A child drew pictures in the dust with his fingers, stories of his brother lost at sea, and the wind brushed his drawings into motion, forming a spiral that glowed with soft light before vanishing. The garden had begun to answer in its own way. Not with speech, not with gesture, but through the patient, slow unfolding of being. Some memories it accepted. Others it returned, not as rejection, but as invitation, to try again, to speak differently, to listen deeper. One day, a man whose hands trembled from too many years of silence came bearing a flute carved from the rib of an ox long extinct. He did not speak. He simply played. The sound was raw, uneven, aching. The tree stilled with every note, and when the final breath of the song faded, no petals fell. Not one. Instead, the tree dropped a single seed. He caught it without surprise, and he left without a word. They say that where he walked, another tree grew. Not a silver-leafed twin, but something older, with bark black as night and blossoms that only opened beneath starlight. Its roots hummed faintly when touched. The people who lived nearby began to dream of things they had never known. Cities made of bird song, deserts that whispered names of unborn children, and oceans that remembered every shipwreck and lullaby. But the silver-leaf tree remained. The garden remained. And the wind still told stories when no one listened. Children born in the new century came with dreams of the garden before they had ever seen it. They described it in detail. The curved paths, the stream with stones shaped like eyes, the small mossy bench that always stayed warm. Some could hum the songs the blossoms made when they fell. One child, too young to speak in sentences, drew the tree again and again in the ash beside the hearth. Always the same number of branches, always 5 blossoms falling, never 6. No one taught them. No one needed to. The caretakers, fewer now and quieter than ever, watched this gently. They did not keep records anymore. They had learned that memory did not need to be preserved, only met. One woman spent her days weaving threads from the wind that passed beneath the tree, catching its patterns in quiet loops. She never finished a single tapestry. Each time she reached the border, the thread would fade in her hands. She smiled when it did. "It was never meant to end," she whispered once. Far to the south, where the air tasted of salt and fire, people spoke of a storm that never landed. 4 days it circled above the sea, humming a deep note that sank into bones and thoughts alike. Fishermen claimed to have seen a single petal floating on the waves, silver, untouched by the salt, turning slowly in the wind. It drifted into the storm's heart, and when it vanished, the winds fell silent. It was not called a miracle. It was called a memory. Some began to wonder if the tree had roots beneath the whole world. Not just roots of wood and soil, but of thought and silence and shared breath. If you stood still enough in any quiet place, some said, and truly listened, you could feel the shape of it pressing gently against the edge of your understanding. Not demanding, not speaking, just being. And still the silver-leafed tree bloomed. The petals now drifted not just down but out, through the cracks in memory, across the thresholds of grief, into the hearts of those who had not known they were waiting. They appeared in places that had forgotten hope, beside hospital beds, beneath bridges where no birds sang, in abandoned rooms where laughter once lived. And they did not bring answers, only presence, only the soft hush of something older than sorrow. And wherever they landed, something softened, something opened. And far away in the garden where it all began, the silver-leaf tree stretched its branches a little further, listened a little longer, and dropped another blossom into the waiting air. And one day the tree dropped no more blossoms. Not because it withered, not because it died. It simply rested. The petals beneath its branches lay undisturbed, as if time itself had stepped aside to watch. The wind hushed. The stream beside the garden fell silent, its rippling slowed to a glassy stillness. The garden paused, not in fear, not in grief, but in awe, as though every stone, every root, every breath within that place understood something had been completed. A boy, not yet old enough to speak his own name clearly, stood beneath the branches. He looked up, waiting, small hands outstretched in the soft light of morning. No petals fell, and still he smiled. The caretakers, those who remained, stood along the edges of the garden. They did not move closer. They did not speak. They had grown old beside the tree, and now they saw it as it truly was. Not a symbol, not a relic, not a secret to protect, but a memory that had finally been heard. Clouds gathered high above, slow and golden with the setting sun. And for a moment the entire world around the tree seemed to breathe. Not heavily, not painfully, just once deeply. Then the final blossom fell. It drifted down like all the others before it, quiet and slow, but with a weight to its silence that pressed into every heart watching. It turned 3 times in the air, shimmering faintly, and landed not in a hand, not on the earth, but in the stream. It floated for a heartbeat, and then sank without a ripple. The stream flowed again. The wind picked up. Birds returned to their songs. And the tree, silver and tall and endless, remained. Not blooming, not fading, just there, so whole, at peace. And everywhere across the world, in deserts, in caves, in lost cities and remembered songs, the people who had once held a single petal felt it vanish from their keeping. Not lost, not taken, just gone. And something within them sighed. Not sadly, not in despair, but as if at last the story had found its final breath.